Nuclear war is a terrifying topic that often gets swept under the rug, but it's one we can't ignore. The idea of an all-out nuclear conflict is something that, for most, seems like a distant nightmare. However, the devastating effects of such a war are not just limited to immediate explosions and deaths. In fact, there's a much bigger picture to consider, one that could have dramatically changed the entire world. This scenario isn't just about cities being reduced to rubble, it's about what happens after. What if a nuclear war could actually freeze the planet? Could this happen, and what would that mean for the future of humanity? To understand this, we need to first think about the immediate effects of a nuclear war. A single nuclear bomb is more than enough to cause immense destruction. The blast wave and the thermal radiation would incinerate everything in its path, leaving nothing behind but a charred wasteland. If multiple bombs were to explode, the scale of devastation would be beyond anything we could imagine. Cities would be leveled, entire populations wiped out, and infrastructures obliterated. The world would be thrown into chaos, with survivors trying to make sense of the destruction. But the story doesn't end there. The real threat to life on Earth could come from the environmental fallout. As the bombs explode, they would release a huge amount of radioactive particles into the atmosphere, along with ash, soot, and other pollutants. The sky would be covered in a thick, choking cloud, blocking out the sun. This would cause temperatures to drop rapidly, and what's known as a nuclear winter would begin. This is a scenario where the Earth's temperatures plummet dramatically, potentially freezing large portions of the planet. How could this happen? Well, it's a simple matter of the sun being blocked by the debris in the air. The thick cloud of ash and soot from the nuclear explosions would prevent sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface. Without the sun's warmth, temperatures could drop by as much as several degrees in just a few days. And while that may not sound like much, this drop in temperature could have disastrous effects. Plant life would die off due to the lack of sunlight, and crops would fail, leading to widespread famine. The ecosystems that rely on these plants would be severely disrupted, and the ripple effect would continue through every level of the food chain. But just how cold would it get? Experts believe that a nuclear winter could cause global temperatures to drop by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. This might not seem like much, but it would be enough to bring about a global crisis. Places that are already cold would become even colder, and regions that are typically temperate could experience snow and frost year-round. The planet would be plunged into a freezing, uninhabitable state, and survival would become nearly impossible for most forms of life, including humans. It's not just the cold that would make life unbearable. The air itself would be polluted, filled with radioactive particles and toxic chemicals. Breathing would become difficult, and the very air would pose a lethal threat to anyone caught outside. It would be hard to find food, water, or any shelter from the cold and the radiation. Survivors would face a new kind of challenge. Not only would they be fighting to stay alive in a world that's turned dark and frozen, but the very air they breathe could be deadly. So while a nuclear war might not literally freeze the entire planet solid, the effects of a nuclear winter could bring about extreme, life-threatening conditions. It's a chilling thought to imagine the entire world shrouded in darkness, cold, and despair. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the long-term environmental effects of nuclear war and explore what would happen to the planet's ecosystems and human survival in a world where nothing seems to grow and everything is covered in radioactive dust. As the nuclear war rages on, the world would be left reeling from the immediate devastation, but the true horror would be found in the long-term effects on the planet's ecosystems. With the sun blocked by a thick layer of smoke, ash, and soot, it wouldn't just be a temporary chill that people would be dealing with. The entire planet's environment would be irrevocably changed. The sky would be dark, casting everything in an eerie, perpetual twilight. Without sunlight, the growing season for plants would end, leading to crop failures all around the world. In a matter of weeks, agriculture would become nearly impossible. The temperature drops and lack of sunlight would decimate crops in fields, while plants in forests and jungles would wither and die. Even the hardiest species, adapted to extreme conditions, would struggle to survive. The ecosystems that we rely on would begin to collapse, starting with the plants that feed everything else. This sudden disruption in the food chain would have devastating effects on all living creatures, from small insects to large mammals and humans. Entire species could go extinct, unable to adapt quickly enough to the harsh conditions that followed the war. As temperatures plummeted, it would become increasingly difficult for humans to grow food. People would turn to what little they could find, but the destruction of farming and the contamination of the air and water would make it nearly impossible to feed the world's population. A global food crisis would take hold, and nations would struggle to provide basic necessities. Starvation would become a major concern, as food would be scarce, and the little that remained would likely be tainted with radiation. The loss of biodiversity would leave the planet's ecosystems fragile, unable to recover quickly from the damage that had been done. But it isn't just plants and animals that would suffer. The radioactive fallout from the nuclear explosions would spread far and wide, contaminating everything it touched. Water sources would become unsafe to drink, as rivers, lakes, and even the oceans would become polluted with radioactive materials. Fish and other marine life would be killed off, further disrupting the food chain and making it difficult for any kind of life to thrive. The air would be thick with dangerous particles, and breathing in these toxic fumes would have devastating consequences for human health. Cancer rates would rise sharply, and people would suffer from radiation poisoning, making survival even harder for those who managed to survive the initial bomb blasts. The long-term effects on the environment and human health would be felt for generations. The radiation wouldn't just disappear overnight, it would linger in the environment for years, possibly even centuries, making it difficult, if not impossible, for life to return to normal. Soil would be poisoned, crops would remain unable to grow, and even the most basic survival needs would be hard to meet. Those who survived would face a world that had been irreparably changed. The future of humanity would depend on how well people could adapt to this new, harsh world, and whether they could find a way to rebuild amidst the chaos. But rebuilding wouldn't be easy. The collapse of human society would create another set of challenges. Without functioning governments, infrastructure, or economies, people would be left to fend for themselves. Lawlessness could take hold, and the world could descend into anarchy as people fought for limited resources. Communities would break down, and survival would become the main priority. Nations that were once powerful and influential would be reduced to ruins, and the global order would crumble. The world would be thrown back into a time where the survival was the only thing that mattered, and human civilization would have to start over from scratch. The psychological toll would be immense. People who survived the destruction would be left to live in a broken world, without the comforts and technologies they once took for granted. Fear, distrust, and despair would permeate every corner of society. With the constant threat of death looming and the world struggling to rebuild, it's hard to imagine what the future would look like. The environmental destruction would make it nearly impossible to return to the world as it once was. Humanity's future would be uncertain, and it would be up to the survivors to figure out how to adapt, rebuild, and survive in a world that had been turned upside down. In the face of all this, we must consider how we would deal with the ongoing environmental and societal collapse in the aftermath of nuclear war, and whether we could truly rebuild from the ashes. As the world continues to grapple with the fallout from nuclear war, it's not just the environmental damage or the collapse of society that would pose a problem. The nuclear winter, caused by the massive amounts of soot and debris launched into the atmosphere, would create a dramatic shift in the climate, with temperatures dropping globally. This nuclear winter would be a severe cooling effect, and it wouldn't just last for days or weeks. Experts suggest it could last for several years, plunging the Earth into an ice age-like scenario. The drop in temperature would be severe enough to freeze lakes, rivers, and even parts of the oceans. In places where ice sheets hadn't formed in centuries, they would become a new reality. The global cooling would make it nearly impossible to grow food in most areas, especially in regions that relied on temperate climates to sustain their agriculture. Crops that once thrived in warm or moderate temperatures would be unable to survive in the freezing conditions that would result from the widespread soot and ash cloud. The oceans, already affected by the radiation, would become even less hospitable. Marine life would suffer as the cold temperatures slow down ocean currents, making it harder for fish and other marine creatures to survive. This would worsen the global food crisis, as fishing industries would be decimated and ocean ecosystems would collapse. With the collapse of marine life, those who depend on seafood for sustenance would find their food sources shrinking, and countries that rely on ocean trade would see their economies come to a standstill. This global breakdown of the food chain would lead to widespread malnutrition, famine, and loss of life across the globe. But it's not just the cold and the lack of food that people would have to worry about. With much of the Earth's surface irradiated, the landscape would be a hostile place. The radioactive fallout would spread across the land, poisoning the soil, making it unfit for farming or any kind of sustainable agriculture. Even if people did manage to grow food, the radiation in the soil would seep into the plants, tainting the food supply. what little life remained would be under constant threat from radiation exposure, which would also affect the health of any survivors. Children, in particular, would suffer from the genetic mutations caused by radiation, and generations to come would be born with defects or illnesses that could lead to a future population crisis. The lack of infrastructure would mean that even basic needs would be incredibly hard to meet. Hospitals, if they still existed, would be overwhelmed with the sick and injured, and the medical supplies needed to treat radiation sickness would be in short supply. Governments overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe would struggle to provide any meaningful aid to the population. In a world without functioning systems of law or order, the struggle for survival would turn brutal. With widespread famine, disease, and lawlessness, some may turn to violence to secure the resources they need. Communities would break down with self-preservation taking precedence over cooperation. The fight for the last remaining food, water, and shelter would shape the new world, and what was once a global community would be reduced to fragmented, desperate groups. People would no longer be able to rely on the systems and technologies that once kept society running smoothly. Power plants would be inoperable, communication systems would be down, and transportation networks would grind to a halt. Without electricity, modern conveniences would be gone, and people would have to return to a pre-industrial way of life, living off whatever resources they could scavenge. The loss of communication would isolate individuals and communities, making it even harder to work together in the face of such widespread chaos. The technological world as we know it would be gone, replaced by a grim struggle for survival. As the cold deepens and the landscape becomes even more hostile, the survivors would face a bleak future. Life as we know it would be irrevocably altered, and the question of whether humanity could ever recover would hang over everything. Would the survivors rebuild, or would humanity fade away in the face of such overwhelming challenges? The long-term effects on our planet and society would be staggering, and it would take generations, if not centuries, to even begin to repair the damage done. Whether or not life on Earth could ever return to what it once was would depend on how well the survivors could adapt and whether humanity could avoid repeating the mistakes that led to such a catastrophic event. In the aftermath of a nuclear war, the damage would continue to unfold in ways that are hard to fully comprehend. As time passed, the Earth would slowly begin to recover, but the scars of the conflict would remain. The ecological balance would be irrevocably altered, and rebuilding civilization would seem like an impossible task. The survival of humanity would be the top priority, but the very idea of rebuilding from such widespread destruction would seem almost beyond reach. One of the most crucial factors in the aftermath of nuclear war would be the survival of the environment. The extinction of many species would be a real possibility, as the radioactive contamination would permeate the land, water, and atmosphere for generations. Even once the radiation levels began to decrease, the long-term effects would linger. Ecosystems would take decades, if not centuries, to stabilize. The soil, poisoned by radiation, would make it difficult for plant life to grow. Even in areas where life would begin to return, it would be a long, slow process before the Earth could support a vibrant ecosystem again. Forests, once full of life, would be reduced to barren landscapes. Wildlife that managed to survive the initial onslaught would struggle in the harsh new conditions, and many would become extinct due to the lack of food or the radioactive environment. The genetic damage caused by radiation exposure would continue to affect future generations. People born into the post-nuclear world would face health issues like weakened immune systems, birth defects, and an increased susceptibility to diseases. The human race itself would be altered by the lingering radiation, with survival becoming more difficult as genetic mutations became more widespread. Some of these mutations could lead to diseases that would further devastate the already weakened population. The question of whether humanity could recover from such long-lasting effects would be a matter of survival for future generations. Could humanity adapt to its new environment, or would it slowly fade away under the pressure of these compounded struggles? The physical environment, of course, would be far from the only thing in need of repair. The collapse of global infrastructure would present another nearly insurmountable challenge. The loss of electricity, communication, and transportation would have long-lasting effects on survivors. Cities, once hubs of activity and civilization, would be reduced to rubble. The complex systems that supported life as we knew it, systems that brought food, medicine, and supplies to every corner of the Earth, would be gone. Rebuilding these systems would be a monumental task. Without the technological know-how and resources, it would be nearly impossible to restore the global networks that made life so interconnected. The knowledge of how to run power plants, factories, and other vital infrastructures would be lost. The people who survived would have to rely on primitive tools, relying on hard labor and ingenuity to rebuild their homes and communities. As the years stretched on, the question of whether humanity could even begin to restore civilization would be one that weighed heavily on the survivors. Even if the nuclear winter began to lift and the Earth began to warm again, humanity would face the challenge of rebuilding from the ground up. With much of the world's knowledge lost, it would be up to future generations to piece together what was left and make a new world from the ashes of the old one. The devastation caused by nuclear war would leave deep emotional scars. The trauma of seeing loved ones perish, losing everything, and living in a world of constant fear and uncertainty would shape the survivors in ways that would last for generations. The psychological impact would be as profound as the physical damage. The world would likely descend into a new kind of darkness, not just due to the lack of sunlight, but because of the deep sense of loss and the haunting realization that humanity had brought about its own destruction. It would take years, perhaps centuries, for survivors to heal, and the scars of the nuclear war would affect every aspect of life. As humanity struggled to survive, one thing would become clear. The effects of a nuclear war would be far-reaching, and the consequences would echo throughout history. The hope for recovery would be dependent on the ability of humanity to come together to rebuild in the face of unimaginable hardship. The fight for survival would be a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it would also be a stark reminder of the dangers that lie ahead if we fail to act responsibly in our pursuit of power. In the end, the question of whether the planet could be frozen or permanently altered by a nuclear war may not have a simple answer, but the answer would ultimately depend on the ability of humanity to learn from past mistakes and create a future that safeguards our world from such destruction. Only through cooperation, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to peace can we avoid the darkest outcome of all, a world where nuclear war becomes our legacy. Today we will be exploring a terrifying hypothetical scenario. What would happen if the Canary Islands collapsed and caused a megatsunami wave? The Canary Islands are a beautiful and popular destination, known for their volcanic origins and stunning landscapes. But there's something about these islands that most people don't realize. They could potentially be the source of a megatsunami, a disaster so massive it could completely change the coastline of the Atlantic Ocean. To understand how this could happen, we need to look at the geology of the Canary Islands. Located off the northwest coast of Africa, these islands are volcanic, meaning they were formed by molten rock rising from deep within the earth. The volcanic activity here is still ongoing, with several active volcanoes, including Cumbre Vieja on the island of La Palma. The western flank of this volcano has been unstable for years, and there's a growing concern among scientists that it could collapse in the future. The collapse of the western side of the Cumbre Vieja volcano would be no small event. It's not just a small chunk of rock that could fall into the ocean. We're talking about a massive landslide with around 500 cubic kilometers of rock crashing into the sea. To put that in perspective, that's enough material to fill up hundreds of thousands of Olympic swimming pools. This sudden and violent movement would displace an enormous amount of water, creating the kind of giant wave that could travel across the Atlantic Ocean and cause devastation on both sides of the ocean. Now let's think about how a wave like this would form. When a massive amount of rock falls into the water, it displaces the ocean's surface, sending shock waves through the water. A normal tsunami typically forms after an earthquake or volcanic eruption, but in this case, it's the sheer force of the landslide itself that would trigger the tsunami. The wave wouldn't just be a ripple, it would be a towering, unstoppable wall of water racing out from the Canary Islands, moving at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour, faster than a jet plane. As the wave moves through the ocean, it would gather strength. The deeper the water, the less noticeable the wave would be on the surface, but as it approaches the coastline, it would begin to rise. The wave would get taller and more dangerous as it reaches shallower waters, with some estimates saying it could reach up to 100 to 150 meters high in certain locations. But the sheer size of the wave isn't the only concern. Its speed would be a massive factor in the devastation it would cause. Tsunamis typically hit with very little warning, and because a megatsunami would travel so fast, people living along the coastlines of the eastern United States, Western Europe, and Northern Africa would have little time to react. There would be no time for evacuation, no time for preparation. just the terrifying sight of a giant wall of water headed toward them. This scenario might sound like something out of a science fiction movie, but it's based on the real geological conditions of the Canary Islands. The instability of the Cumbre Vieja volcano has been studied by scientists for years, and while the collapse is not guaranteed, the potential for such an event is far from impossible. And if this were to happen, the consequences would be unimaginable. In the next part of this video, we'll dive deeper into what exactly could happen if the collapse occurred, and how the wave would impact specific regions across the Atlantic. But for now, let's just keep in mind that the risk is real, and understanding what could happen is the first step in preparing for such a disaster. If the collapse of the Cumbre Vieja volcano were to happen, the consequences would be truly catastrophic, with effects felt across the entire Atlantic Ocean. A megatsunami, as the name suggests, would be no ordinary tsunami. This would be a wave so large that it would not only affect the Canary Islands, but also create a chain reaction across both the European and American coastlines, completely altering the landscape. Once the massive landslide occurred and the rock crashed into the ocean, the force would be enough to push huge amounts of water into the air, forming a massive wave. This wave would travel across the Atlantic at a staggering speed of 500 miles per hour. In the deep waters of the ocean, this wave might not be noticeable, but as it neared land, its height would increase dramatically. The closer it got to the coastlines of the eastern United States, the western coast of Europe, and the northern coast of Africa, the higher and more powerful it would become. One of the most concerning aspects of a megatsunami triggered by this collapse is its sheer size. Scientists estimate that the wave could reach as high as 100 to 150 meters in some places. For comparison, that's about the height of a 30-story building. Imagine a wall of water taller than a football field is long, rushing toward you at terrifying speeds. It's easy to understand why such a wave could cause unprecedented damage and loss of life along coastlines that are typically considered safe from the usual tsunami threats. On the eastern seaboard of the United States, places like New York City, Miami, and even as far as the Gulf Coast would be vulnerable to the initial impact. The wave would crash into these cities with little to no warning, demolishing everything in its path. The force of the water would cause extreme flooding, destroying buildings, infrastructure, and even displacing millions of people. Coastal communities, which are typically bustling with life and activity, would be wiped out in moments, with the entire region left to deal with the aftermath of an event of this scale. The western coast of Europe would not be spared either. Cities like Lisbon, Barcelona, and even parts of the UK could face the devastating effects of the wave, given that many of these cities have coastal populations. The human toll would be astronomical. The intense flooding would also damage critical infrastructure, including roads, airports, and communication systems. The loss of life would be staggering, and the recovery process would be nearly impossible due to the overwhelming scale of destruction. And let's not forget about the northern coast of Africa. Countries like Morocco and Algeria would also face the full force of this megatsunami. The coastal cities in these regions are home to millions of people, and they would experience the same fate as those in Europe and the United States. The devastation would be widespread, leaving countries and governments struggling to respond in the face of such an unprecedented disaster. In addition to the immediate impact of the wave itself, the after effects of the megatsunami would be catastrophic as well. The wave would cause massive flooding, but it would also result in huge waves of destruction that would reshape the coastlines. Beaches, harbors, and even entire islands could be wiped off the map, leaving nothing behind but debris and chaos. The long-term environmental effects would be equally severe, as saltwater floods could destroy farmland and freshwater sources, leading to long-term food and water shortages. It's important to understand that the threat of such a mega tsunami isn't just some theoretical disaster that could happen centuries from now. The science suggests that the Canary Islands are inherently unstable, and while a collapse like this might not occur in the immediate future, it remains a possibility that we cannot ignore. The chance of it happening might be low, but the potential consequences are so enormous that it warrants serious attention and preparation. In the next part, we'll take a closer look at the science behind how tsunamis work and why this specific event could lead to such an overwhelming wave. We'll also explore how we might be able to prepare for or mitigate the effects of this disaster. But for now, it's important to understand just how far-reaching and devastating a mega tsunami from the Canary Islands could be. As we dive deeper into the science behind tsunamis and how a mega tsunami from the Canary Islands could unfold, it's important to understand the fundamental process behind a tsunami's creation. Tsunamis are typically triggered by three main causes: earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or massive landslides. When large volumes of water are displaced by these events, they create waves that spread outward. However, a megatsunami, like the one triggered by the collapse of the Canary Islands, would be on an entirely different scale. When the Cumbre Vieja volcano's western flank collapses, around 500 cubic kilometers of rock would plunge into the ocean. This sudden displacement of water would create an initial surge, forming the giant wave that starts moving across the Atlantic. Unlike regular tsunamis, which are usually the result of seismic activity, a megatsunami can be caused by a landslide, and its waves behave very differently. As the rock crashes into the sea, it creates massive, violent waves that travel quickly but have the potential to grow much larger as they approach land. In the open ocean, this wave could travel as fast as 500 miles per hour, almost as fast as a commercial jet. But the speed isn't the only important factor here. As the wave moves toward land, the depth of the ocean decreases, causing the wave to slow down. However, this doesn't mean the wave diminishes in power. In fact, as it slows down, the wave's height increases dramatically, a phenomenon known as wave shoaling. So, what might start as a relatively small wave in deep water could quickly become an enormous wall of water when it reaches shallow coastal regions. For the Canary Islands megatsunami, scientists estimate that in some locations, the wave could grow to heights of over 100 meters or around 300 feet. To put that in perspective, that's taller than a 10-story building. This is much larger than any tsunami we've experienced in modern history. The energy of the wave would be so great that it would crush everything in its path, wiping out entire cities in a matter of minutes. The destructive power of the wave itself is not the only danger. Tsunamis often create a phenomenon called run-up, where the wave surges inland, pushing water far beyond its normal boundaries. This can lead to the flooding of entire coastal regions, displacing millions of people and causing widespread destruction. The energy of the wave would also create strong currents, which would make it nearly impossible for anything to survive, from buildings to vehicles, as they would be swept away by the overwhelming force of the water. In addition to the initial surge of the tsunami, the after effects would be just as devastating. After the first wave crashes on shore, the water will recede back into the ocean, drawing debris and people back with it, before rushing forward again with even more force. Tsunamis typically come in multiple waves, and the second or third wave could be even larger than the first, catching people off guard and leaving no time for evacuation or preparation. These waves could keep hitting the coast for hours, creating continuous chaos and destruction. One crucial aspect of a megatsunami, like the one triggered by the Canary Islands collapse, is the global scale of the disaster. While the immediate destruction would be focused on coastal areas, the effect would ripple across the globe in unexpected ways. Coastal flooding and destruction would likely cause massive disruptions in trade and travel, impacting the global economy. The loss of ports, airports, and infrastructure would hinder the ability to deliver goods, impacting everything from food supplies to energy production. Furthermore, the environmental impact of a megatsunami would be massive. Saltwater flooding could wipe out ecosystems, killing plant and animal life, particularly in areas that rely on coastal ecosystems for food and resources. Farmlands could be flooded with salt water, making them unusable for years to come. Freshwater supplies would be contaminated, creating long-term shortages in many regions. The health consequences would also be severe. Thousands, if not millions, of people could be displaced from their homes, creating massive refugee crises. In addition to the immediate loss of life, the long-term displacement of people would lead to public health emergencies, with overcrowded shelters, inadequate sanitation, and the spread of diseases. Hospitals would be overwhelmed, and it could take years to restore basic services in the affected areas. As terrifying as this scenario is, scientists are still studying the likelihood of the Canary Islands collapsing in such a way. While the risk of an immediate collapse is relatively low, it's not impossible. The Cumbre Vieja volcano is still active, and its history of landslides means that there is always some degree of risk. However, the fact remains that a megatsunami triggered by the Canary Islands would be one of the most catastrophic events in recorded history. Next, we'll look at how scientists and governments are working to understand the risks and what we might be able to do to mitigate the potential effects of such a disaster. As we wrap up this terrifying hypothetical scenario, of a megatsunami triggered by the collapse of the Canary Islands, it's important to consider what can be done to prepare for such an event. While the immediate effects of such a disaster would be catastrophic, there are steps that could potentially mitigate the damage and save lives. One of the first things scientists and disaster experts would need to focus on is early warning systems. Tsunamis can sometimes be detected through seismic activity or by monitoring changes in the sea level, but a megatsunami is different. The sheer size of the wave could mean that there would be little time for evacuation. In order to save lives, it would be crucial to have a robust global warning system in place that could provide at least some lead time for coastal regions. This would involve monitoring volcanic activity, landslides, and the overall stability of the Canary Islands, as well as investing in systems that could give coastal communities as much warning as possible. However, the challenge with a megatsunami is that it could reach coastal areas incredibly fast, particularly on the east coast of the United States. If the wave was traveling at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour, it would take just hours for it to reach the eastern seaboard after the collapse. And since the warning time might be short, the ability to evacuate entire coastal cities would be difficult. Planning evacuation routes, creating public awareness campaigns, and investing in resilient infrastructure could help reduce the number of casualties, but it's clear that preparation would be a huge challenge. In addition to evacuation and early warning, governments and experts would also need to consider the long-term recovery process. Even if lives could be saved, the impact on infrastructure, economies, and ecosystems would be immense. Rebuilding destroyed cities, repairing ports, and restoring power grids would take years. In some cases, it could be decades before coastal areas were habitable again. The economic consequences would be severe, not just for the regions directly impacted by the tsunami, but for the global economy as a whole. Supply chains would be disrupted, industries would be crippled, and countries would face long-term financial strain. Another consideration is how this disaster could impact the world's food supply. Coastal regions are major producers of seafood, and the flooding caused by a megatsunami would likely destroy much of this industry. Additionally, farmlands and freshwater sources would be contaminated by saltwater, making it difficult to grow crops. This would not only affect local populations, but could lead to global food shortages, especially in regions heavily dependent on imports. The environmental toll of such a disaster would also be far-reaching. The massive displacement of water would disrupt marine ecosystems, and the destruction of coastal habitats would have a lasting impact on wildlife. Species that rely on coastal areas for breeding or feeding could face population declines, and ecosystems could take decades or even centuries to recover. The loss of biodiversity would be a tragedy in itself, but it would also have broader implications for human populations, particularly those who rely on these ecosystems for food and resources. In the aftermath of a megatsunami, the world would need to focus on rebuilding, but it would also need to take a hard look at how we approach natural disasters. The collapse of the Canary Islands is a reminder that our world is vulnerable to forces we can't always control. And while technology and science have advanced, we still don't fully understand how to predict or prevent these types of catastrophes. It's a sobering thought that something as immense as the collapse of a volcanic island could trigger such widespread destruction. Ultimately, while the odds of this kind of disaster happening are low, the potential consequences make it something worth taking seriously. Governments, scientists, and emergency planners need to continue researching and preparing for worst-case scenarios. It's vital that we learn from the past and build better systems, infrastructure, and strategies to deal with the unimaginable. Though the Canary Islands collapse may seem like a distant, unlikely event, the lessons we can learn from such hypothetical scenarios could help save lives in the future. So, while the idea of a megatsunami sweeping across the globe may be terrifying, it's essential to remain vigilant, stay informed, and be prepared for any disaster, no matter how unlikely it may seem. Thank you for joining me in exploring this catastrophic possibility. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on the matter. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more videos that dive into the most intense, frightening, and mind-blowing disaster scenarios. Imagine waking up tomorrow to find that the oceans have risen by 200 feet overnight. The shock would be unimaginable. Coastal cities, which are home to millions of people, would be submerged in a matter of hours. Think about New York City, Miami, or even places like London and Tokyo. Each one would be drastically altered, with many of these iconic skyline is vanishing beneath the waves. Roads, buildings, and infrastructure would all be lost, leaving nothing but a flood of water and debris. Entire populations would be displaced, forced to abandon their homes and seek refuge on higher ground. For those living in low-lying coastal areas, it would be a complete nightmare. The immediate effects would be devastating. Not only would human habitats be destroyed, but the ecosystems along the coast would be wiped out. Wetlands, forests, and animal habitats that rely on the balance of the land and sea would be completely destroyed. Species of animals that rely on these environments, like coastal birds, fish, and even some land mammals, would struggle to survive or face extinction. This would set off a chain reaction, with disruptions to food sources and the delicate balance of life on Earth. Freshwater sources, which are already threatened by rising sea levels, would be completely contaminated. Salt water would flood aquifers and rivers, making it nearly impossible to drink or use the water for irrigation. Water shortages would become widespread, and regions that depend on freshwater resources would face enormous challenges in providing for their populations. The agricultural industry would also suffer. Crops along coastlines would be destroyed, and the land that once supported farming would be rendered infertile because of the salinity introduced by the rising seas. In places that once thrived off agriculture, food scarcity would become a massive issue, leading to a global food crisis. Economically, the toll would be astronomical. Many of the world's largest cities are located along coastlines, and these areas are central to global trade. Shipping ports, which are responsible for moving goods across the globe, would be lost. The economic fallout would be immense, with industries depending on coastal infrastructure brought to a halt. The disruption in trade would send shockwaves through the global economy, affecting everything from small businesses to international markets. Nations with large coastal populations would face not only the loss of their infrastructure, but also a loss in economic stability, with millions of people left without jobs or homes. The environmental damage would extend far beyond the immediate destruction. The entire planet would feel the effects. Species that have lived along coasts for centuries would be displaced, and the natural habitats that supported them would be gone. This wouldn't just be a problem for wildlife. Humans would also be facing extreme climate conditions. With the loss of the coastal ecosystems, the Earth would lose critical carbon sinks that help keep our planet's temperature regulated. The loss of wetlands, mangroves, and other coastal features would mean a decrease in the Earth's ability to absorb carbon dioxide, further accelerating the effects of climate change. It's a vicious cycle that could intensify the global warming crisis even further. As the oceans creep higher, there would be even more pressing questions. Where would displaced people go? How would nations with limited land take in millions of refugees? The political and social strain would be unimaginable. Countries would struggle to handle the migration of people forced from their homes, and this could lead to conflict. With so much of the world's population concentrated near coastlines, countries would be facing a new wave of refugees, and many governments would be unprepared for the scale of the crisis. The world as we know it would be changed overnight. This isn't a scenario that could be brushed off as something far in the future. Climate change is causing sea levels to rise, and while a rise of 200 feet in a single night is extreme, we can already see the signs that our world's coastlines are becoming more vulnerable. The next few decades could bring an increase in extreme weather events, more floods, and rising sea levels, perhaps not to the extreme we're imagining here, but certainly enough to cause serious disruption and distress for millions of people. This scenario forces us to confront the reality of what could happen if we don't address the ongoing threats posed by climate change. The problem may seem distant, but the threat is real, and it's time we start taking it seriously. Would humanity be able to cope with such a rapid rise in ocean levels? Could we adapt quickly enough to prevent total devastation, or would we be too late to avoid the worst of it? These are the questions we must face now before the waters rise any further. If the oceans were to rise 200 feet overnight, the immediate effects would go far beyond just the physical destruction of cities and infrastructure. The sheer scale of the damage would be something humanity has never seen before. In addition to the loss of human life, the damage to the environment would be irreversible, and the consequences would ripple across the globe in ways we can't fully comprehend. As we imagine what this world would look like, it's important to think about how the sudden submerging of land would affect the entire planet's ecosystem. The rise in sea levels would drown forests, wetlands, and other ecosystems that thrive at the edge of land and water. Imagine the coastal forests, which are home to countless species of animals, birds, and insects. They would be wiped out almost instantly. The tidal surge would destroy delicate ecosystems like mangroves, which act as vital buffers, protecting coastlines from erosion and providing habitats for fish and other wildlife. Without these natural defenses, coastal areas would become more vulnerable to storms and erosion, worsening the impact of climate change over time. The changes would not be confined to the immediate area of the flood. The shifting of the ocean levels would also alter ocean currents, which play a crucial role in regulating the Earth's climate. The Gulf Stream, which is responsible for transporting warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic, could be disrupted, potentially triggering a chain reaction that could change weather patterns around the world. The sudden surge in sea levels would also flood freshwater rivers, lakes, and aquifers, mixing salt water with what is normally fresh water. As these waters encroach on human settlements, they would contaminate supplies of clean water, turning them into salty, undrinkable sources. In many places, freshwater supplies are already under stress, and this additional strain would push the planet's most vulnerable communities to the brink of disaster. Agriculture, which relies heavily on stable climate conditions and predictable weather patterns, would be severely impacted. Coastal farmlands, some of the most productive in the world, would be swallowed up by the ocean along with fertile soil that nourishes crops. The loss of crops would lead to a global food crisis, as agriculture across affected regions would be severely crippled. Coastal cities that rely on fishing as a primary source of food would lose their access to marine life, as the habitats that sustain fish would also be flooded and destroyed. Even those who rely on the land for crops would suffer as farmlands are contaminated by salt water, rendering them useless. This would create a situation where food security becomes a global issue, affecting not just the regions closest to the rising seas, but also nations far inland. Additionally, the rise in ocean levels would expose the global economy to unprecedented shocks. Countries with heavily developed coastal cities would see their economic power drained, as cities like New York, Tokyo, and London are home to some of the world's largest financial institutions. These cities are crucial hubs for international trade and finance, and their destruction would send shockwaves through the global market. International trade would come to a halt as ports are submerged, preventing goods from being shipped to various parts of the world. Industries that rely on coastal infrastructure for shipping and manufacturing would collapse. The loss of these economic centers would cause massive job losses, and the ripple effects would be felt for years as nations scramble to rebuild and adapt to the new realities of a world that has been dramatically reshaped. On top of the environmental and economic challenges, there would be a massive social impact. As millions of people are displaced, the crisis would create refugee situations on an unprecedented scale. Countries that already face pressure from migration would now have to deal with a surge of climate refugees seeking shelter in more inland areas. This could strain existing infrastructures and resources, particularly in regions that are not well equipped to handle large numbers of displaced people. Governments around the world would need to coordinate a global response to provide housing, food, and medical assistance to those who have lost everything. But this would also put stress on governments and organizations that are already stretched thin, potentially leading to political instability and social unrest. While the ocean rising by 200 feet in one night is a terrifying hypothetical, it brings into focus the real threats that rising sea levels pose over the long term. While we may not see such a drastic change overnight, the effects of climate change are already visible and the need to act has never been greater. In many parts of the world, the effects of rising sea levels are already being felt through increased flooding, coastal erosion, and extreme weather events. If we continue on the current path without taking meaningful action to address climate change, the world we live in could become unrecognizable. This hypothetical scenario pushes us to consider what's at stake if we don't take drastic steps to reduce our impact on the planet. The fate of future generations could very well depend on the choices we make today. As the oceans rise 200 feet, the survival of countless species, including humans, would be at risk. It's not just the coastal areas that would face destruction, but the planet as a whole would experience significant changes that would be felt in every corner of the world. The loss of biodiversity would be one of the most tragic outcomes. Entire ecosystems that are reliant on specific climates and landscapes would be wiped out. And it's not just the land that would be impacted. Marine life would also suffer, and entire food webs would collapse. Species that rely on shallow coastal waters for breeding, such as sea turtles, dolphins, and coral reefs, would be devastated by the rising tides. What's even more concerning is that the impact wouldn't stop at the oceans. The way our planet absorbs and distributes heat would change. The loss of landmass would alter the albedo effect, which refers to the reflection of sunlight off the Earth's surface. With so much of the land covered by water, the Earth would absorb more heat, speeding up global warming and possibly triggering more extreme weather events. This would include more intense storms, floods, and droughts, making the planet harder to live on for both humans and animals. The changing temperatures would also have a direct effect on agriculture. As certain regions become submerged, others could experience unpredictable weather patterns, with some areas becoming too hot to grow crops and others suffering from extreme drought. Countries that rely on farming to feed their populations would be hit hardest. Cities and regions that are already vulnerable to heat waves would see temperatures soar to dangerous levels, making living conditions unbearable. Areas that were once ideal for farming may turn into deserts, while places that are already arid could become uninhabitable due to the added stress from extreme heat and water scarcity. The process of displacement would also be far more complex. With entire regions becoming submerged, there would be no place for millions of displaced people to go. Refugees would flee not just to neighboring countries, but to places far inland, where they would face overcrowding, lack of resources, and increasing poverty. The strain on inland cities would create significant challenges. Housing, food, and jobs would become scarce, and local governments might struggle to provide for the large influx of people. Communities that were once stable could be thrown into turmoil, and the social fabric of entire regions would begin to unravel as resources become even more limited. This forced migration would also have a lasting impact on global relations. Countries that are already dealing with political instability or strained resources could face new pressures, potentially leading to conflict over territory, water, and food. With governments stretched thin, the ability to maintain order could be severely compromised, leading to greater instances of civil unrest. Military forces may be called upon to maintain order, but in the face of such widespread disaster, even the most powerful nations might struggle to keep things under control. This could lead to tensions, not just between nations, but within them. One of the most alarming consequences of rising sea levels would be the loss of cultural heritage. Entire cities that have stood for centuries, places with rich histories, art, and architecture would be lost to the ocean. Ancient civilizations like those in Egypt, Greece, and Italy, whose coastal cities have weathered the test of time, would see their most precious landmarks washed away. Historical sites like the pyramids of Giza, the ruins of Pompeii, and the Great Wall of China could be submerged, taking with them the legacies of past civilizations. This loss of history would be tragic, as many cultures would lose the physical remnants of their heritage. At the same time, the physical landscape would be dramatically altered. Mountain ranges that were once isolated from the oceans would now become surrounded by water. New coastlines would emerge, but they would be barren, lacking the ecosystems that once flourished. Islands and coastal cities that were once vibrant and full of life would become ghost towns, leaving behind nothing but remnants of human civilization. And as the flood waters would likely shift, this new geography could disrupt the Earth's weather systems even further, causing unpredictable weather patterns and new challenges for all life on Earth. While such a massive change in sea levels may feel like a distant and far-off possibility, the reality is that rising seas are already happening, though not at such an extreme pace. We are beginning to see the signs in coastal cities around the world where flooding has become more frequent and severe. The changes in our environment, whether gradual or sudden, are a reminder that the planet is a delicate system, and pushing it beyond its natural limits can have disastrous consequences. The best we can do is to mitigate the damage as much as possible, but a scenario where oceans rise by 200 feet would be far beyond our capacity to reverse. The only way to prevent such a future is by taking immediate, substantial action to combat climate change today. The more we wait, the more likely we are to face an uncertain future that we are not prepared for. As we near the final stretch of this exploration into the catastrophic effects of a 200-foot rise in ocean levels, it's important to reflect on the larger picture and consider the lasting legacy this kind of change would leave behind. Beyond the immediate devastation, the world would face an ongoing struggle for survival, with every aspect of human life dramatically altered. If the oceans were to rise 200 feet, the loss of land would essentially reshape the entire geopolitical structure. Countries would lose major cities and entire regions, and the impact on global populations would be astronomical. A Economies that once relied on agriculture, tourism, and coastal industries would be wiped out. Countries like the Netherlands, which are known for their battle against rising sea levels, would see their centuries of expertise rendered useless in the face of such an extreme threat. There would be nowhere to run. Everyone, no matter where they are, would be forced to adapt or perish. The environmental consequences would be irreversible. For those who are lucky enough to survive, the world that they would inherit would be a barren, hostile environment. With much of the planet now underwater, the loss of biodiversity would be severe. Without coastal ecosystems to protect marine life, coral reefs would disappear and the loss of vital species would cause a collapse in the food chain. With the world's coastal habitats submerged, it would be nearly impossible to reverse the effects on the planet's ecosystems. Even if drastic measures were taken to combat climate change and environmental degradation in the aftermath, the damage to natural habitats and wildlife would likely be beyond repair. On a social level, the rise in sea levels would leave deep scars. The worldwide dislocation of people would cause massive psychological strain, as entire communities would be scattered, leaving families divided, homes destroyed, and lives upended. Cultural traditions, stories, and the very identity of entire regions would be lost as they disappeared beneath the rising waters. For the survivors, a new sense of community would be essential, as humanity would need to band together in smaller, more isolated pockets to rebuild what was lost. This rebuilding process would take generations, as the infrastructure that sustained civilizations before would be gone, leaving only the ruins of the past to serve as a grim reminder of what we lost. A critical issue that would emerge in this new world would be the scarcity of resources. Fresh water would become even more valuable, and access to clean drinking water would be a matter of life and death. As agricultural lands are lost and food sources become increasingly scarce, the ability to grow enough food to feed the surviving populations would be a monumental challenge. The world would see widespread hunger, malnutrition, and poverty, all of which would lead to intense social unrest. Access to food, water, and shelter would become the primary concern for every survivor, and communities would fight not just for land but for basic survival. In the midst of this devastation, the global community would be forced to reconsider how we approach the environment and climate change. It's easy to ignore the warnings or hope that the worst will never happen, but when the worst does strike, it will be too late to reverse the damage. The idea of waiting for technological advancements or policy changes to solve such a monumental issue is a dangerous illusion. The world would have to act together as one, to learn from past mistakes and come together to prevent the unimaginable from becoming reality. Perhaps one of the most powerful lessons in this hypothetical scenario is that every single action we take today has far-reaching consequences, from the smallest personal choices we make regarding energy use to the largest global decisions about climate change policy. Each action adds up. The rise in sea levels, while unimaginable in its extremity, is not entirely beyond our control. The future may seem uncertain, but the path we choose to take today will determine whether future generations face an apocalyptic reality or a world with a fighting chance for survival. As we conclude, it's clear that while a 200-foot rise in ocean levels is a terrifying hypothetical, it's a reminder of the fragility of our planet and the urgent need for action. The time to act is now, before the oceans rise too high to stop. The question remains, will we rise to the challenge, or will we wait until it's too late?